Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Rocky Reef Brewery. Welcome to Science on Tap. Thank you. We've got a great crowd tonight. So great to see everyone after the summer. And my name is Susan Knight. I work at University of Wisconsin Trout Lake Station. Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, an idea conceived in 1905 that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. Our partners in Science on Tap include Minocqua Public Library, WXPR, Wisconsin Alumni Association, UW Trout Lake Station, and UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, and of course our hosts here, Rocky Reef Brewery. And Science on Tap is supported through a grant from the Brittingham Fund to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And don't forget, you've got 3 ways to watch. You can come right here, as you all are tonight. We also have live video streaming if you can't make it out or it's a cold winter night. And you can also watch any event later because we've got them all archived. So 3 different ways to watch. Our next event in November, November 7th, will be No Child Left Inside with Bryn Loddick, talking about how important it is to get children outside. Tonight, we are honored to have PJ Leash of UW-Madison Department of Entomology, Insect Diagnostic Lab. Patrick, known as PJ, Leash is an extension entomologist with the UW-Madison Department of Entomology. His primary role is to serve as the director of the University of Wisconsin Insect Diagnostic Lab, where he handles approximately 2,500 insect identification requests every year. PJ also teaches on the UW-Madison campus and provides entomology-related outreach throughout the state, including regular appearances on Wisconsin Public Radio's Larry Mailer Show. I'm sure you've all heard that. PJ grew up in southeastern Wisconsin, spent many of his early years capturing critters near the pond in his backyard. He also spent many summers up here in the Lakeland area and wandering the woods and lakes and bogs. And to get him started in his insect career, he had a summer internship position looking for invasive emerald ash borer in southeast Wisconsin. And then he continued working with insects as a grad student at the UW-Madison. PJ took over the reins at the UW Insect Diagnostic Lab in March of 2014, 10 years. Wow. And has been in his current role a little over a decade, like I said. Outside of work, he's a silent sports enthusiast, loves spending time in the North Woods with his wife and 2 kids and their black lab, Charles Darwin. And here's your trivia question for PJ. PJ loves outdoor activities and is fond of running, mountain biking, cross-country skiing, hiking, kayaking, generally exploring the North Woods. Sounds like he fits right in. He once kayaked from his family cottage on Lake Shishibagama all the way to Torpy Park in Minocqua. You can look at the map and say, wow, that would have taken a long time. He wanted to see if it could be done, and it can be. It's not easy. Of all the outdoor activities, PJ is especially fond of trail running, and some of his favorite running sports in the area include Minocqua Winter Park and Raven Trails. So what item does he carry with him while running, just to be prepared? A, insect repellent. B, toilet paper. C, insect collecting vials. B, C. C, insect collecting vials. A true entomologist. Now here is PJ Leash. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight to talk about, well, bugs. It's okay to call them that, by the way. Being an entomologist, everyone has their own terminology. I interact an awful lot with the general public, so that the term bugs is fine with me. And if you would ask me, I think I have probably the best job in the entire state, because you heard, technically I get to run the UW Insect Diagnostic Lab. In a nutshell, that means I get paid to identify bugs. I mean, they pay me to do that. Really? there's a lot more to it than that. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I get to see some pretty neat stuff come through my lab doors every single year. During the summer months, that might mean 20 to 30 samples a day. And these days, as you can imagine, I mean, most folks in this room probably have that smartphone with a 8, 10, 12, 100 megapixel camera on it these days. I don't know what they're quite up to in terms of resolution. You can take some really good insect pictures and email it to me, and I can zoom in on my phone or on my computer screen and often figure out what that is. And so I do see a lot of the same things again and again, but every once in a while I get to see something really unusual. And it's not too surprising when you think about it. Wisconsin, we're home to roughly 20,000 or so different species of insects. Then you've got all the spiders, ticks, mites, centipedes, millipedes, other kind of creepy crawly bugs on top of that. So there's always something new to find. I mean, it's interesting. Life as an entomologist, just the way I go about my everyday life. If you've ever spent time with a naturalist on a hike, they tend to have two speeds. They're probably, their normal walking speed or power walking, or they're stopped and they're 50 yards behind you, kicking open a rotten log or something like that. And so I, of course, fall into those two categories of things. And as we heard from the trivia question, an entomologist is always off duty without vials in their pocket, because you never know quite when you're going to bump into something really, really unusual. And I find weird things that I've never seen before all the time. Just in my own yard in Middleton, Wisconsin, in the last probably month or so, I have found at least 3 things that I have not bumped into before. One was a weird family of true bugs, the order Hemiptera. One would be an invasive species that is only known from 2 spots in the state, one of which happens to be my backyard. Makes me wonder, it's probably a little bit more common than that. It's also known up in Green Lake County, but found some larvae recently when I was planting trees, and that's the only spot in the entire state these have been found. Happens to be my backyard in Middleton, Wisconsin. And then just a few days ago, I was flipping over some logs we have in our yard and found a type of land planarian, which is not an insect. It's a type of flatworm or planarian, but it's a non-native species that happens to contain tetrodotoxin. If you've heard of tetrodotoxin, this is the pufferfish toxin. So I find weird stuff in my yard all the time. So maybe it's a little bit of a curse to have this mindset of always be looking for weird things, but it's also a blessing as well when you can recognize all these little players in the ecosystem around us. And insects are absolutely around us everywhere. Again, with 20,000 or so estimated species in the state, they're everywhere you look. If you've spent time cross-country skiing up here in the Northwoods on a mild winter day, there are things you can find on the snow. We've all probably bumped into snow fleas where it looks like someone has just dumped that pepper shaker out on the snow. But there are some other things, a little bit more elusive. Winter crane flies, winter scorpion flies, and things like that. So you can find plenty of insects during the winter months, but during the summer months, there are tens of thousands of different creatures you could potentially bump into. And they play some really important roles in the world around us. I mean, we hear in the news all the time about pollinators or bees in decline. Pollination, of course, is one very important ecosystem service that they provide to us, but they do a lot of other really beneficial things, and I think they tend to fly under the radar. They are doing things that people take for granted and really don't notice or think about, like breaking down fallen leaves and plant material. Or how many of us actually think about roadkill on the side of the road? You drive by, you go, ugh, look at all the flies on that. But really, the insects are playing really important roles of breaking down those materials and recycling those nutrients. So kind of nature's recyclers or garbage men, if you will. Also, just their activity of digging, aerating the soil can provide some benefits to plants. Lots of other things that they do as well, including serving as predators and parasites out in the ecosystem. So they're everywhere. You'll start looking for them. You'd be amazed how many different creatures you could find in your own backyard if you really put your mind to it and spend some time doing that. But I will also say we are hearing more and more in the news about insects facing potential declines on a global basis. And I think as a whole, we're going to hear more and more about this in the next probably decade or two. there were some big reports that came out in the last 5 or so years, and there's a group of scientists, both nationally and internationally, that is really looking at this topic and trying to figure out what's going on, because these are creatures that play key roles in the ecosystem, like serving as a basis of food webs for all the songbirds that we have around, especially during the summer months, that rely on caterpillars, as an example, for food for their young. So these creatures are all connected, and I think we really need to kind of put our thinking caps on and think of ways that we can help out insects to help mitigate some of these declines that we're seeing. But every year is a little bit different for me in terms of what I see at the diagnostic lab. Again, I see some of the kind of run-of-the-mill things again and again and again. I always see some pretty unusual things as well. So before we get into questions, I did want to highlight a few of my favorite insect stories for the year, arthropod stories. I should expand that a little bit. One has been going on rather recently. I mean, we've been hearing the unfortunate news about the damage from Hurricane Helene in some of the southeastern parts of the U.S., but it always interests me as an entomologist when I watch some of these storm systems going on in the southern Atlantic and into the Caribbean, because that can affect national weather patterns. And there's actually certain insects that we tend to see more of when we get some of those storms, because it can alter the national weather patterns, the jet stream, and so on. So just in the last about 2 weeks or so, I have had an influx in reports of a creature called the black witch moth, which has a wingspan of about 6 inches. Looks like it's something tropical, because it essentially is. This is a creature that typically is found in parts of South America, Central America, might make it into a little bit of Texas and places like that. But when you have these hurricanes and tropical storms and stuff, it can basically fling them up thousands of miles. So this is kind of the opposite of what monarchs do. You know, monarchs fly down to Mexico, takes them, maybe 2-ish months to do that. These are large 6-inch moths that are making it up here in the span of a few days. And sometimes they make it to Wisconsin. As you can imagine, their wings are just beaten and tattered to heck. And other times you look at them and they're spotless, and you just wonder, how the heck did that thing blow up here 2,000 miles being assisted by the hurricane? And for that particular species, there's actually some papers documenting transport by hurricanes and other things. There was, I believe it was Hurricane or Tropical Storm Claudette many years ago, and some folks that had been hunkered down, staying in the area, they went out when the eye passed over. And imagine going out in the eye of a hurricane. It's dead calm for that 20 or so minutes, and then just seeing hundreds of these gigantic moths flying around. There's some really weird stories like that. So just in the last couple of weeks, I have been seeing reports of those black witch moths, things like Titan sphinx moths. We've all probably seen at least or heard of sphinx moths or hummingbird moths, which will sit there and hover right in front of a flower and can be mistaken for hummingbirds. But there's a species I've never bumped into before called the Titan sphinx moth. Somewhat similar story to the black witch moth. Does much better, Gulf Coast states, locations like that, and have had a couple of sightings here in the state very, very recently. So again, sometimes I get to see some really interesting trends and live a little bit vicariously through cases at the lab. One other interesting thing that showed up at the lab, actually a couple of times this year, would be scorpions, which, I talk to folks from around the country sometimes, and, we at least don't have scorpions in Wisconsin. We don't have alligators up here either. But I've now had 3 cases this year of live scorpions being spotted in Wisconsin. At least in one of them, we knew it came in with a shipment of bananas in Milwaukee area. So that makes sense. But the most recent one was a situation over in Prairie du Chien, where a gentleman was sitting in his house, sees this crawl across his floor. It's a species that's native to kind of the south central U.S. Are they necessarily pushing farther north? I don't think so. I suspect it probably did come with human movement of one kind or another, but still, sometimes weird things will show up here in Wisconsin. Perhaps the single biggest story for me this year, though, was the periodical cicadas. And did any of you head to southern Wisconsin to experience those? Illinois, okay. Yeah, so if you didn't get to see the periodical cicadas, well, you missed your chance. You got to wait 17 more years. That's how long it takes for them to come out. I have to do some mental math for how old I'll be then. But Yeah, it was a mind-blowing experience. I spent some time in May and June driving through parts of southern Wisconsin, chasing some of these, just trying to better document where they occurred in the state, and had a community science project as well where folks could submit their sightings and photos and reports of them, and found some pretty neat stuff like counties they had not been spotted in for decades, like Lafayette County, and really documenting that they're there, which was pretty neat. Of course, the absolute best spot to see them in the state was Lake Geneva down in Walworth County. And we ended up doing a big outreach event down there, which we called Cicada Palooza. Ended up drawing about 500 folks just to come and take guided talks to learn about piratical cicadas. And it was so cool. It was surreal just driving into the town of Lake Geneva, and you would just hit a wall where even though my car radio is on, you could hear them around us. It was just so loud and absolutely everywhere. Before the event, I went there for a media day press conference for it, and within about 2 seconds of getting out of my car, I mean, they're flying on me, landing on me. So I'm like a kid in a candy shop. You know, this is Christmas. The folks that live there maybe had slightly different opinions, but it was a big draw. I mean, we had a lot of kind of insect tourism folks flocking to that part of the state. So again, it was a really cool, just a big insect story this year. And again, if you missed it, you got to wait 17 more years for it, unfortunately. Just to put things in perspective, so as an extension entomologist who does a lot of outreach, in a given year I might do somewhere in the ballpark of 35 to 40 media interviews, so TV, radio, newspaper, and so on. I hit about 100 sometime in the first 2 weeks of June. So I've done about 130 media interviews this year, and a lot of those, probably close to 100 of them, related to cicadas. So it was a fun, wild ride. I'm also glad the cicadas are a little bit gone for 17 more years, but that was one of the absolute biggest insect stories of the year. How many of you bumped into earwigs this year? Yeah, some grumbles out there, not many fans of earwigs. With some of the rainy conditions in spring and early summer, this was absolutely one of the best earwig years that I have ever seen. It's the European earwig. It's not even a native species, has been in the state about 30 or so years, but it can be found essentially statewide at this point. But that was another one that jumped out to me. Japanese beetles were an interesting one as well. If you live in the area, how many of you have had to deal with Japanese beetles? Wow, lots of hands go up. So what's interesting is if I asked that same question in Madison area this last year, you'd see maybe a few hands go up. Or you'd have people say, yeah, I saw a few, didn't have to worry about them. And that was my experience as well. If I went back 5, 10 years in parts of southern Wisconsin, their populations were much higher, much more problematic. So it's been really interesting to me, especially the last 3, 4, 5 years, watching that insect and how it's been evolving in the state, the situation. Historically, it was much more common in southern parts of the state. The last 3, 4, 5 years, relatively quiet. In my own yard, if I saw 3 on a plant at a given time, that was a lot. But in the state, you get up to about the Highway 29 corridor. From there on north, it's been more of the Wild West. So it's definitely been pushing its way farther north in the state. I mean, that's an insect that we didn't have detected in Wisconsin sometime it was about the 1950s, 1960s. At first, we thought, oh, it's too cold. It'll never catch on here. But it's certainly caught on. It's been pressing its way farther north. And so while things are relatively quiet in the southern half of the state, there's been a lot more activity up here in northern Wisconsin. Now, one other thing, though, I want to mention about Japanese beetles. So y'all should keep an eye out for this next growing season when it's warmer. If you're looking at Japanese beetles, check right behind their head. There's a shiny, kind of rounded region, technically called the pronotum. Think of it as their neck region, if you will. There's a particular type of fly. This is a parasitic fly. It's not a true parasite, though. A good parasite doesn't kill its host. This is a parasitoid. This is an insect that does specifically kill its host. And this is a fly called the winsome fly. And what it specifically does is it'll lay a white egg or 2 or 3 eggs, and these are visible to naked eye. So you'd look at a Japanese beetle, you see these couple of white spots just behind the head. that beetle is doomed because those eggs are going to hatch. The little fly larvae or maggot is going to burrow inside and then consume the Japanese beetle. So heck of a way for the Japanese beetle to go. But for us, it's kind of, the definition of schadenfreude, I guess. The reason I want to mention this is historically, winsome fly has not been very abundant in Wisconsin. But just this year, I started getting some reports where folks were finding quite a few of these. So that's certainly a good sign. This is perhaps some evidence that this winsome fly is catching on, getting a foothold in the Midwest, and in the long run, it might help us lower the populations of Japanese beetles. And just a personal story to go along with that, when my wife and I bring our kids up here during the summer months, we'll often get up early, sneak out, go over to Bottled Bean to grab coffee, and then we'll wander around downtown in the morning and head back before the kids have woken up yet. And so it was late July, and my wife and I were stopped right outside the Minocqua Library because it wasn't open yet, and looking at a shrub there, Japanese beetles on it, actually on some grapevines. This is like right outside the main door to the library. If you've been there, you'll probably recognize it. Japanese beetles there, sure enough, winsome flies. Quite a few of them, the eggs on the Japanese beetles. That's cool that we've seen that insect, evidence of that parasitoid, right here in Minocqua area. So I think that's pretty cool to share. And then one other thing I want to mention in terms of insect trends, we're in the North Woods, we have water, we always have mosquitoes. That's just kind of the way of the world. A lot of other parts of the state, the mosquito numbers were pretty mild. I mean, we had the rainy conditions early to start the season, but then we hit July or so, things dried out. And so many parts of the state, we didn't have a whole lot of mosquito activity out there, but there's still a few out there. And I always get the question, will the frost kill the mosquitoes? In some cases, yes, but there are certain mosquitoes that overwinter as adults, and they're just looking for a rock pile, a hollow, rotten log to get into. They're going to hunker down, spend the winter there, and then if it warms up to 45 on a January day, you technically could get a mosquito bite if they're flying around and active. So those are some of my insect trend highlights. I'd be happy to hand it over for questions.
Okay. So, anybody who has questions, Amber is right. Yeah, I think I'm too close to him. There we go. Amber, raise your hand. And remember to wait for Amber to come to hand you the microphone because we're recording this. And we can't hear the questions, so don't just yell it out. Raise your hand and Amber will come around.
In the introduction, you mentioned about the emerald ash.
Well, hang on.
In the introduction, it was mentioned about your interest in the emerald ash borer. Are we any closer to a deterrent for these problematic insects?
Yeah, great question. Personally, it's been really interesting to watch that insect because, as you heard from the intro, I was looking for it in the state before we even knew it was here. This was back about 2005 or so. So almost 20 years at this point that I've been working or studying that insect one way or another. Looking at the bigger picture, we don't have anything great at this point in terms of having an impact on that one. Historically, we, meaning the U.S. as a whole, has done things like quarantines to try and slow the movement, contain it to specific areas. But we found with humans moving firewood and other things, it just got moved around way too quickly. And so the federal agencies like USDA, APHIS, rather than putting efforts into quarantines, they are now putting their efforts, a lot of them, into biological control. So that is the use of what in this case involves little stingless parasitoid wasps, maybe about this big. And so if you saw one of these things flying through the air, you would just say, oh, it's a little gnat. They have no interest in stinging you, even though they're a type of wasp. And there's a couple of different species. Some are specifically targeting the larvae of emerald ash borer. Some are targeting the egg stage. In my mind, we're still relatively early in the ball game when it comes to those, when you look at the big picture, because to simply raise those beneficial organisms, it's very, very labor intensive. You need live emerald ash borer larvae to raise these beneficial insects. So to simply do that logistically, people were having to like grow ash trees, to infest with emerald ash borer, to raise these wasps, to release them. They've gotten a lot better at it. They now have a rearing facility over in Michigan, if I remember correctly. Basically, they've been able to scale up their production. So they were doing more and more releases, and that is my hope for the long run, is that if they do enough of these releases, will we finally hit a critical mass where it starts to really knock their populations down. We're not there quite yet. And so unfortunately what that means is, at least for the next decade or a couple of decades, this thing is still going to rear its ugly head. It's going through the state. I mean, if you go to places like southeastern Wisconsin, it's essentially gone through and killed all the susceptible ash trees. Northern Wisconsin, it doesn't have as much of a presence, but just this year it was finally confirmed in every single Wisconsin county for the first time. So it is making its way into the North Woods. It's starting to expand out of these areas, and that's going to have a lot of big impacts up here. But again, where will we be in 20, 30 years? That's kind of the billion-dollar question I don't have the answer for, but my hope is that some of those biocontrol agents will start to really catch on. We are seeing some evidence of them establishing and reproducing out in nature, which is a great sign. They're able to withstand, our winter conditions and things like that. But again, we need a critical mass of those. And I like to remind folks, when it comes to biocontrol like this, in some situations we have a pest that comes in, you release the correct biocontrol agent, a predator or parasite, and it can work relatively quickly sometimes. In other cases, it may seem like it flops on its face, or it can take a very, very long time for it to kind of click, so to speak. And we did see something very similar with another invasive insect called spongy moth, or these days it's called spongy moth. It used to be called gypsy moth. That one was in the country for well over 100 years before this introduced fungus really kicked in and started to cause their populations to crash if we have the right weather conditions. So I always like to use that, as possible, something we can learn from, in that these biocontrol efforts, sometimes they can take quite a while before they kick in and start working in high gear. But that's my hope from the long run.
I have a question regarding looking again at the bigger picture. In the example that you gave of the Japanese beetle, I thought you might mention that perhaps we got rid of quite a few lawns, which would be anti to the larviform, would have a contributing factor of getting rid of them, looking at the bigger picture. So how much time does the university start looking at, you talk about trends, you talk about centuries, just as you said about the gypsy moth. When are we going to start looking at habitat as a solution? And my real question was, have we updated? We have two corn pests, which jumped over into soybeans, and BT corn was supposed to take care of that, and it hasn't. In fact, these insects reproduce so fast. Two larviforms of moths, again, that's what they are, reproduce so fast that they jumped from corn to soybean, and rotation didn't do any good. Scientific America, about 2018, said one of the big chemical companies, who, would have to come up with a new BT, a new bacteria that would eat holes in the stomachs of those larvae. Has anything happened on that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, for certain pests, and each insect, I will say, is a little bit different when it comes to management. And we have some insect pests are just notorious due to some of their genetic factors for developing resistance. So one good example of that, a very well-known corn pest, perhaps the single biggest corn pest, corn rootworm. That one is just notorious. You throw one thing at it, it develops resistance to it, and they try something else, and it works for a year, 2 or 3 years, and then it develops resistance. So that's always something that folks are having to kind of chase and try and figure out for management. So that's a big struggle that farmers have to deal with. And it's a complex situation because you have, the scientists with data saying, this seems to work okay, but if you rely on it too long, it's going to break. It's not going to work anymore. And then sometimes you have, commercial forces at play. This seed is discounted or whatnot. And so that can make some interesting situations. They're always working on new management approaches for these, chemical and non-chemical, which I think is really exciting. One thing that interests me in this realm of managing pests is some of the technology that's being applied and where is it going to lead in 10 or 20 years, for example. And I think there's a lot of ways that if the technology advances, it may be able to hopefully reduce pesticide inputs in situations like this. I have, for example, a colleague, Dr. Emily Bick, who is working on acoustic devices that can basically listen to a corn stalk and pick up the vibrations and be able to tell which insect or insects are feeding on it and how abundant are they, and use that to be able to inform pest management decisions. And so if you could look at all this data and throw it together and say, okay, if your pest level is this, it does not make economic sense to apply a pesticide versus, if their population is that, then it makes more sense for the farmer. So I think there's a lot of cool research going on this topic, but it's a struggle for some of those crops, especially when the economics, don't want to say dictate, but when the economics are such that it really encourages folks to keep planting the same crop again and again, that can certainly lead to problems with some of these pests that feed specifically on those crops.
Just a quick clarification. When you say Japanese beetle, and some people use the term Asian ladybug for the same thing.
Yeah,
they're two different, way different.
Way different.
Right.
One is a type of ladybug, and the other is a scarab beetle.
Is the scarab.
Yes, that's
and
correct.
The Asian ladybug is way different.
Yes. Yes.
That's the thing that I've been having more problem with.
Yeah, and that's as an entomologist, it's a struggle with what we call common names. I mean, these are the everyday names we use, and most insect species will not have a common name. They simply go by their scientific name, and usually the common names may relate to where they originate on the planet, Japan or Asia or some other place. And so, yeah, I totally understand. You hear some of these names, they sound similar, Japan, Asia, things like that, and folks commonly mix up those two all the time, but they're completely different beetle families. Japanese beetle, notorious pest. The multicolored Asian lady beetle can be pest in some situations, like if they're sneaking to your house right now, but in other situations, like if you were a soybean farmer and they're feeding on aphids, they're actually helping you out in that regard. So very, very different creatures to think about.
I have a two-part question. The one situation I've had, I was a beekeeper back 2008 until recently, and it's always been a struggle, but in the last 5 years, it's impossible to keep bees here in town. I had my speculations, but I was curious if you have recognized that pattern. You'd already said there's been a decline, but my bees are stressed and they cannot survive. And we've had some really mild winters too. So then my second part was you had mentioned maybe some citizen science groups. Is there anything on iNaturalist that you're a part of that us citizens can be a part of it today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate those. So with the honeybees, that's a tough one to answer, and I wish I could offer you a little bit more insight. I don't happen to be a beekeeper myself. I've taken some beekeeping classes and things like that, but it'd be a great question for someone that has been doing beekeeping for, say, 30 or so years. I know it's certainly a struggle, and especially with all the things you have to stay on top of as a beekeeper, dealing with diseases and parasites. And we do know over time, varroa mite as an example has become very, very problematic and a big challenge for keeping honeybees. And if anyone is not familiar with varroa mites, you've got your honeybees in your hive, you're taking care of. Varroa mite are these ectoparasites. So it's like a tick. essentially, that feeds on the hemolymph or blood of the honeybees, and it weakens them over time. So if I were a honeybee, it would be like having a tick about this size on me. So that's going to be kind of hard if you have 2, 3, 4 of those on you. So that can be a major problem for beekeepers as a whole. And I think there's a lot of factors that play into why it's so challenging to keep honeybees. I mean, you've got these diseases and increasing parasites like veromite. You also have, in some cases, just a general decline in areas where the bees can forage. And so that's a challenge as well. And then you can have, your colony that maybe is in good health, or it seems to be, and you have some other colonies in the area that are not in good health, and those bees out in nature, they can bump into each other. And so that can spread things around, so that can make it very, very challenging as well. In terms of citizen science, there's quite a few different projects out there. Really kind of depends on where your interests lie. There are some great ones related to things like bumblebees. There's Wisconsin Bumblebee Brigade, so if you Google search that, you'll be able to find it. There is a national, I think it's Bumblebee Watch, if I remember correctly, but these are projects where you can watch for the given insect you're surveying. Bumblebees, take pictures of it, upload it, and help survey for those insects in the state, help gauge populations, that sort of thing. So I know there's some bumblebee ones. There are some citizen science projects related to monarch butterflies, where folks can do things like tag them with stickers, and then that can help track their migration. Or if you find one with a sticker on, you can report where you found it and that sort of thing. There are some related to ladybugs. The winsome fly that I mentioned, that's Winsome. That's one that my colleague, Dr. Bill Hutchinson at University of Minnesota, he's actually got an iNaturalist project related to that insect. And so that's one where if you happen to spot those characteristic white eggs on the neck region of a Japanese beetle, you can upload that and share with them, and they're pulling data from around the Midwest to see where these things are going on. So there's quite a few different projects out there related to insects and other invertebrates.
Hello. I don't really have a question. I just want to thank you because you helped me deal with my lily leaf beetle problem a couple of years ago. I actually sent the bugs physically to your lab. You or your people responded back to me and told me what to use, and I've been having really good luck with my Turk's cap lilies ever since, so thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear that. If you are not familiar with lily leaf beetle, if you grow true lilies, they won't feed on daylilies, but if you have true lilies, they can get there and they can clobber those plants. It's something that I've now got in my own yard that I have to deal with, but a lot of folks in the state have to deal with that insect. And when you look at the distribution of lily leaf beetle, the epicenter, so to speak, is really the Wausau area. Back in 2014, when that insect showed up, it showed up in like 5 or 6 different municipalities in Marathon County, like at the same time. And so we said that, probably came in with plants for like a big box store, Wausau area. Folks drove into town, bought it, moved it back. But now when you look at the distribution map of that insect, which I've got on my website if you're interested, it's most of the northern part of the state, but it's also made some big jumps over towards Twin Cities area, Door County, Dane County, southeastern Wisconsin. It's really moved around to dozens of counties at this point. And again, if you grow true lilies, it is just a tough one to deal with.
I have 2 questions. One is I've been monitoring monarchs for probably 10 years. I have a milkweed patch in my yard. This year, is it imploding? What's happening? Normally, I have about 150 monarchs that I help hatch. This year is 10. And part of me is thinking, was it not the hurricanes, the tornadoes this spring that blew them off course, or is this going on nationally? And I have another question, and this is probably not a popular question. Are the mosquito and tick control sprays, how do insects interact with those areas? Do they fly into those areas and fly away, or what happens to them when they fly into those areas? Thank you.
Sure. So for the monarchs, it's been an interesting year. And it's always hard to gauge when you're, out and about in your garden. You see a monarch here, a monarch there. But it's really hard to gauge, what does that mean comparing, July 2nd this year to July 2nd last year. So the best measurement that we have to assess monarch populations is when they all fly down to Mexico, their overwintering grounds. So they all pack on these particular type of fir trees in a mountainous area. It's just the right altitude. It's not too low and too hot. It's not too high and too cold. It's Goldilocks. It's just right conditions for them. So they pack very, very densely, thousands, tens of thousands onto these trees. And so scientists aren't out there counting individual butterflies. What they do, though, is they say, okay, the butterflies are in this area. We can estimate their density. We're going to basically measure the amount of area in acres or hectares. And that is their yardstick. So every year in about February or March, new numbers are released for the amount of area that the overwintering monarchs are occupying. And what we saw this winter compared to the previous one is it went down over 50% compared to last year. So there's always some variability from year to year, but if you were to plot the long-term trend over about the last 30 or so years, it's definitely trending downwards. So that is a very tough situation. The federal agencies actually looked at the eastern population of monarch butterflies a few years ago, and they were asked this question, should they be listed as an endangered species? And so it went through this very, very lengthy review process. And what the federal agencies came back with the decision of, and the way it was termed was warranted but precluded. And what that means is, in the eyes of the government, protection as an endangered species is warranted. The but precluded part means there were too many other species in line in front of it. So they're basically waiting in line at the moment. So the point I want to make is, the trend with the monarchs, it's alarming in terms of what's going on. Earlier this year, when we were getting into the growing season, in spring, we were getting sufficient rain. I was rather encouraged by that because usually when I see adequate rainfall, that's great for plants, milkweed and nectar plants and things like that. And so I was thinking this will be great to have them have a good year, boost their numbers, and hopefully this coming winter their numbers are higher. And initially my impression was that it seemed like that. Their numbers might have been doing okay based on reports I was getting. And then we ran into about later June into July, things started getting really dry. And then sightings went down. And then I started getting call and email one after another throughout the latter parts of the summer. I'm not seeing very many bees or bumblebees or monarchs. What's going on? And so that was a definite trend that I had there for several months. It's interesting, about a month ago, I watched a national webinar through the Entomological Society of America by a guy who's a caterpillar expert, Dr. David Wagner, and he's also a leading expert on insect declines. There's a bunch of papers that have been published on insect declines, and his paper is one of the best known ones, and it basically describes insect declines, and this is applicable to monarchs, but insects as a whole. It's kind of death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's not one single cause. It's a lot of interacting factors, land use changes, loss of nectar plants and things like that, weather conditions and so on. But one thing that David mentioned we'll probably be hearing more about is dry conditions and drought in particular can be very, very hard on insects. And so I really wonder this year when we did start running dry, that was probably pretty bad on monarchs and other insects is my suspicion. And when we look at Wisconsin weather as a whole, and of course, we're a good-sized state. What's going on in Douglas County can be different than Kenosha County. But if you were in a part of the state the last 3, 4, 5 years that has been running dry or drouthy, that can have some really significant impacts on insects such as monarchs, either directly or indirectly by affecting the plants that they're associated with. So unfortunately, that was kind of the observation that myself and many others were seeing, is that it just seemed to be a pretty poor year overall for monarchs. Now, I don't want to sound too doom and gloom. You know, that might have been the situation in Wisconsin if other parts of eastern North America were having better conditions and we had great monarch production there. You know, will there be plenty that make it down to Mexico? I'll keep my fingers crossed that that's the case, but in terms of that good, reliable measurement, we won't know until about February, March of next winter when that's released, the overwintering tally. So in terms of how they fared overall, Wisconsin, they seem to be down, but we won't know for the eastern U.S. as a whole until kind of next winter. So that was the monarch question. And then you had also asked about the mosquito treatments, and that's something that I have been spending a lot of time thinking about. And it's hard to find an answer on that. If you go on Google, you know, we pull out our smartphone and we type, do mosquito treatments harm other insects or something like that, it's hard to get a clear, concise answer on that because there's different types of mosquito treatments. And a lot of the fact sheets and bulletins and reports you'll find are from places in like the southern United States, where they're doing different types of mosquito treatments. They are often doing what we call ULV, or ultra low volume treatments. This is where you take a very small volume of a pesticide, maybe an ounce or two, and you're almost atomizing it, like super small particles. This creates essentially a fog, if you will. And you're doing this typically after dark, so sundown, nighttime, when the mosquitoes are active. And we know with those types of treatments, it has to do with some of the physics involved and other factors, but they can work against mosquitoes. These droplets dissipate, so it's a very short-lived sort of impact. And insects that have a body mass larger than mosquitoes generally don't seem to be impacted by those. So that's good news. Now, if we stop there, we would say, okay, mosquito treatments don't hurt other insects, but that's not the case. That's not what we're doing here in like Wisconsin. If you have a company out to spray your yard, what they're usually doing is called a barrier treatment. So they're spraying your shrubs and trees and things like that. And those are residual insecticides from the pyrethroid group. And depending on the product, those might last a couple of weeks. In a lot of cases, it may be about a month or so. And so what it's doing, it's creating a coating or barrier on these leaves of trees and shrubs, and those are broad spectrum products. The same product might be sold for use against mosquitoes. It might also say you can use it to spray Japanese beetles on there as well. So the point I want to make is, if you are spraying plants in your yard with those sort of treatments and they sit there for a month, other insects that contact those treated surfaces could be impacted by them. So that could be butterflies that land on it, leafcutter bees that clip off some parts of the leaf material to use for nesting purposes, things like fireflies, which we know love to land on plants to flash, they could be impacted by that as well. So those sorts of treatments have a very, very broad spectrum of activity. Now, if you did that one time, you know, you've got an outdoor wedding, a kid's graduation party, that's one thing. But if you are doing that once a month throughout the entire growing season, then those plants in your yard are basically coated with an insecticide that can affect a very wide range of insects. And so I think that can really have a lot of negative impacts on insect populations. However, there's not a whole lot of studies that have actually looked at that. There's two that I'm aware of. One of them is actually from Dr. Karen Oberhauser, who recently retired. She's a monarch expert, and she did an experiment where they basically did a simulated mosquito treatment, so backpack sprayer. They sprayed milkweed plants, and then they put monarch caterpillars on there to see what would happen. And so, you know, intuitively it makes sense. You spray a plant like that, you put a monarch caterpillar on there right away, the caterpillar dies or doesn't do well because of that. But again, what they were finding is they would treat these plants and then they'd put a caterpillar on a week or 2 or 3 weeks later, and it was still impacting those. So again, if you are spraying this throughout plants in your yard, broad spectrum product, things that go on there to nibble on the leaves a little bit or walk around could be impacted by that. So I think we need to do a lot more research on those. And again, there just hasn't been much published on them. There is one other paper I'm familiar with that looked at a study like that with honeybees, and those bees went to plants, treated plants, about a month later and were impacted as well.
Hi, this is sort of a follow-up to the mosquito spray question. We live on a lake, and probably half the people on our road have mosquito treatments all summer. And I looked up the companies, and they claim that it's an all-natural product. It's derived from a chrysanthemum plant. But I also noticed that I have seen probably maybe only 10% of the dragonflies we usually have, which eat mosquitoes. And I'd like to know if you have any opinions on what the chrysanthemum ingredient is and how that affects other insects.
Sure. So if you take certain types of chrysanthemums, you can crush them up and extract out certain naturally occurring chemicals that happen to have insecticidal properties. These would call the pyrethrins, or pyrethrum is another name for them. And it's not one single chemical. It's actually, it's a super mixture of all these closely related molecules. So to a chemist to look at the molecular structure, they're going to have a lot of similarities, a lot of long chain carbons, double bonds, things like that. And actually, humans have been aware of these pyrethrins for a very, very long time and use them for pest control purposes, crushed chrysanthemum powder and things like that. The thing is, if you were to use these natural pyrethrins or pyrethrum, those break down very rapidly in sunlight, generally within about 24 hours or so, meaning it's a very short-lived thing. The pyrethroid insecticide, so pyrethrins, pyrethroid, these are derived from pyrethrin, but the chemists have tweaked the molecules in the lab to make them more potent for insects, safer for humans and mammalian toxicity, but also made them longer lasting. And so depending on the ingredient and how it's formulated, yes, they're technically like based on some of the molecules from chrysanthemums, but they have been modified to be very potent for insects and very long lasting. It might last 2-ish weeks, might last a month. Some of the products from that group, depending on how they're formulated, might last upwards of 60 to 90 days.
These have all been high impact topics, and so mine's going to seem trite in example, or in comparison. But I observed something for the first time last winter. I take my dog for a walk every morning, every evening, and I was walking down the road, and there was a blanket of snow. It was temperatures were probably in the low 20s, and this happened twice. I actually took pictures, and lo and behold, there was a spider walking across the snow. I'd never seen anything like it before. I did a little bit of initial research online, and they mentioned a couple species of arachnids, I can't remember what they were anymore, that actually in the winter live just below the surface of the snow or below the ice. And I learned that much, but it was rather striking to experience this. I was wondering if you could add to that a little bit.
Yeah. So I've actually seen that many times myself, places like the Minocqua Winter Park and other areas around here. And there's actually, if I remember correctly, at least 10 or 12 families of spiders that have members within that group that can potentially be active on the snow. So it's not like 1 or 2 species. There's actually a whole bunch of them. But you bring up an interesting point. There's this entire hidden world when you have a good snow covering. There's that space, the interface between the ground, the soil, or the fallen leaves and the snow. That's called the subniveum. And all sorts of creatures rely specifically on that because it insulates them. It buffers them from the extreme cold. You got all these creatures living there, and then if you have a day that's relatively mild enough, and for them that might mean it's got to be in the 20s or 30s, they'll pop out and be active on the snow, and if it gets too cold, they just go down into that insulated zone again. So it's really cool. During the trivia and introduction part, you heard I always have insect files with me, even when I'm cross-country skiing, because there are some things you can spot when you're out on the snow on a mild winter day.
How do the cicadas get so big?
Oh, I appreciate the question. How do they get so big? Well, it's kind of how they evolved that way. One factor related to that might have to be in terms of how long they feed for. So when we see our everyday cicadas that we can see around here in many parts of the Midwest every year. Our dog day cicadas, for example, we see some every year, but they actually have life cycles that can last 3 to 5 or more years. And so that gives them a long time to feed and potentially grow and develop bigger. When you think about the periodical cicadas that live for 17 years, they've got 17 whole years to do that. So in general, a lot of cicadas tend to be kind of some of our largest insects in the state. I will say that when you look at the U.S. as a whole, there are some cicadas that aren't terribly big. There's some called grass cicadas, for example, that are under an inch in length. They're maybe about 5/8, 3/4 of an inch in length. So maybe about that big, which as far as cicadas go is relatively small, and that's more in line with some of our everyday insects we see around here.
When I heard the promo for this program tonight, I heard Susan Knight say that there's a real concern about a diminishing number of beneficial insects. What's the story?
Yeah, I mentioned this a bit earlier, but we are facing insect declines essentially around the world. And so this is something that I think we really need to pay attention to because it's linked to so many other creatures. Like our songbirds, as they're passing through or coming up to breed during the summer months, they rely specifically on insects to feed to their young, often caterpillars specifically on oak trees and other trees like that. And so if the insect numbers are going down, that's going to have a whole cascade of impacts on other animals, wildlife, but also humans in terms of pollination services. You know, if the bees just start disappearing outright, what's going to pollinate our crops? That's going to be a very tough situation for, you know, cranberry growers in the area to deal with and things like that. So that's a tough situation. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago watching a national webinar through the Entomological Society of America by David Wagner, a caterpillar expert, but really a scientist leading the charge on the insect decline front. And he's got a good paper that describes it as death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's not one single thing that we're doing or is going on. It's all these things that are contributing to this decline of insects as a whole. So it's things like land use changes. And what I mean by that is, you know, if we could magically look at an aerial view of Minocqua and Woodruff and Arborvitae today compared to 100 years ago, compared to 500 years ago, you know, no one's going to argue there. It looks different. It certainly does. So we've had changes like that. We have, in some parts of the state, very, very intensive agriculture, where the agriculture field these days, because of some of the management approaches, it's essentially a monoculture of corn or soybeans, almost no weeds if you have good weed control. And so there's very little diversity in situations like that. You got the pesticide inputs coming in for agricultural uses, residential uses, and so on. Those are contributing to it. And so all these factors are adding together, and we have been seeing some very significant declines of insects in some spots on the planet, which is very, very alarming. Initially, a lot of this was kind of anecdotal. Folks would drive from southern Wisconsin to the North Woods and say, you know, I used to have to stop and squeegee my windshield 2 or 3 times. That's literally called the windshield effect. I mean, there's a term for that, and these days, you know, you're not having to do that so much. And so it's alarming when we can see this. It's really hard, though, to be able to pick that trend out over time. You need big, massive data sets to be able to do that. One of the best data sets was associated with a paper that came out a few years ago from Germany. And they went to some nature preserves. So these are areas that, you know, weren't being impacted directly by agriculture, but they basically were weighing insect biomass. And they had about 30 years of data, and they could plot this decline over time. And we've been seeing a lot of other papers kind of plotting that same trend. So it's very, very alarming that this is going on. I think we're going to see a lot more research over the next decade or two related to this, and hopefully some larger efforts to try and combat this, because it's going to impact our everyday lives as well as wildlife around us.
Good evening. Our daughter, who vacations in the Mercer area, was diagnosed with a spider bite that actually evolved into cellulitis. And the clinicians and everybody said it was a classic brown recluse bite. But from what I see, they aren't, do they exist in Wisconsin or not? And if they do, where? I guess that's what I'm trying to pin down.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm really sorry to hear about that. I hope they've recovered from that. That's certainly the most important thing. In a nutshell, we don't have brown recluse spiders in Wisconsin. The native range of them is really the south central parts of the U.S. If I wanted to go to find brown recluse spiders, I would go to maybe parts of Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska. They make it into parts of Missouri, southern parts of Illinois, for example, but we're outside the native range of that particular species. Have they been found in the state before? They technically have, but exceedingly rare. And one important thing to know about brown recluse spiders is, somewhat joking when I say this, but they probably wouldn't cross a street to save their lives. Their behavior is they don't like to move. So what that means is there's a few instances where someone moves to Wisconsin from Missouri. They pack up all their books and stuff. They bring it. They have brown recluse spiders in their house, something like that. Those spiders won't move to the house next door. It's just not their behavior. They like to stay put. So again, there have been some exceedingly rare instances of that. But what that means is if you have brown recluse spiders, you'd have a population of them and not a one-off. So there's a few buildings I know of in the state where you could go and find them. But there's a really good book out there about brown recluse spiders by Rick Vetter, who's now retired. He's an arachnologist. He was in California for many, many years. And Rick basically went on a crusade to help dispel some of the myths associated with brown recluse. I mean, you start Google searching brown recluse, you can find all sorts of photos and stuff, and are they truly brown recluse bites? Who knows based on the photos. In a lot of cases, it's probably something else. And so Rick Vetter spent probably 20 plus years really debunking some of these myths. And it turns out there's been issues even in the medical community with diagnosing and really misdiagnosing things as spider bites. And Rick Vetter has had a number of papers talking about this where there's a long list of other things that can present as kind of maybe some sort of wound or festering wound or something like that gets blamed on a brown recluse bite when there's really an other underlying cause. Now, hard to kind of sort through all those possibilities for a medical professional, but that's been well documented. So Rick Vetter has actually, I've got one paper saved in my computer where, and he's written a lot of these papers, co-authored them with medical professionals, because they realize it's an issue. And so he's written some guidelines, for diagnosing a verified recluse bite. And in a situation like this, we're outside the native range, which already makes it really suspect that it would be. Also, when you think of things like their behavior, they really don't like to bite, period. There's a study out of, I believe, Kansas, if I remember correctly. It was a family lived in a house. And researchers followed this family for something like 3, 4, 5 years. Thousands of brown recluse spiders in the house. No one was ever bitten. So they really don't like to bite. Also, when there are verified bites, about 90% of them are simply a localized reaction, similar to like a bee or a wasp sting. 10% of them potentially can lead to that more severe, necrotic type wound. But then Rick Vetter basically pointed out, you start crunching the numbers and looking at the odds of this. You're outside the range. You can't find any evidence of a brown recluse spider in the area. They don't like to bite. Only 10% of verified bites actually get, kind of a necrotic wound. And you say, what are the actual odds of this happening versus, kind of Occam's razor? What are these other very viable possibilities? So, it's always hard, I would imagine, being a medical professional and trying to make and figure out what's going on in some of these cases. But when we're outside the range of that spider and you can't find any evidence of them, then it kind of makes you wonder, is there something else going on?
For the past few years, there's been millipedes that have been paying me a visit in my house. And I'm wondering what attracts them?
Oh, what attracts them? Cheerful personalities, a nice smile. No, so the story with millipedes is they like to wander at night. So millipedes love decomposing plant matter. So that could be a woodlot. You know, you live in the North Woods, you just have rotting logs and fallen leaves. That's great habitat for them. If you were in another part of the state where you had a prairie area or CRP land behind you, that can very easily be millipede habitat. Even in your own yard, if you have you're into a lot of gardening and you have a big compost pile or something, that can be a good millipede source. So you have these good millipede habitats, and a few things can go on. If their populations build up high enough, they can get to a point where they're kind of bumping elbows, they want to spread out and disperse. That can cause them to kind of get out and scatter more. Also, if you had them in, say, let's just say in theory it was like a low-lying kind of prairie-ish area, and you get a really heavy rainstorm, that can force them to kind of look for higher and drier areas. So the point I want to make is you probably have some decent millipede habitat around you, and they can wander long distances at night. They can easily millipede that big could potentially wander 50, 100 yards. So you're seeing them around your house, but the actual source could be quite a ways away. Now, they're wandering around at night when it's dark, the sun starts to come up. They don't want to be caught out in the bright sunlight. That's kind of death to a millipede, if you will, because they can dry out and desiccate, basically bake in the sun. And so they're looking for sheltered hiding spots. So they're getting in through nooks and crannies. That often causes them to sneak into garages, foundations, get into window wells, and things like that. From their point of view, it's really an accident when they make it indoors. They really wouldn't want to do that, because if they end up in a basement or in your living room, it's going to be too dry for them. Again, they really like a pile of rotting leaves. Unless you have rotting leaves in your basement, it's not good habitat for them. So they sneak in, they desiccate, they die after a few days. They really don't want to do that. So it's kind of, the situation is they're wandering around, they're sneaking in accidentally, and then you're finding them and you're having to either vacuum or sweep them up, and they're probably dying if they're in your house any length of time. Now, you might be wondering next, what can you do about it to stop them from coming in, unless you're just an all-around millipede fan. Probably the best thing you could do, and this would be a little bit of time and effort, but if you can look at the outside of your home for any cracks or crevices where they might be getting in, and see if you can seal that up with caulk, expanding insulation foam, Baccarod, anything like that to physically seal things up better. In the pest control industry, we'd refer to that as physical exclusion. But in theory, if your house is sealed tight and they can't get in, you won't have problems with them in your garage or basement. So that can also be things like checking the weather stripping and stuff like that. But you generally can't stop them outright. There are certain times of the year where you might see their activity ebb and flow, and you see a bunch of them this month and they're gone, a month later, but you just kind of have to ride them out and do your best to keep them outdoors.
Thank you for all this good information. So a quick question about tent caterpillars. So about 20 years ago, when we purchased our property, we heard more about tent caterpillars and the effect they were having on leaves. And I don't even recall exactly which trees, but can you describe what's happened to them? Do they have a cycle? Are they present in other parts of the state? Are there conditions that bring them back? So just, general behavior of tent caterpillars and incidents. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the question. So tent caterpillars, I guess there's a couple different things I want to mention. The first is a tent caterpillar that makes a tent. That's the eastern tent caterpillar in spring. And that one is, for the most part, specifically associated with cherry trees in the woods, so black cherry, things like that, or fruit trees, apple, crabapple, and so on. And those are the ones that make the silken tent, kind of where the branches meet the trunk. And that's when I tell folks that you can identify driving down the interstate at 70 miles an hour. You can pick out both the black cherry and the insect on it when it's May and you're seeing that. Those usually don't cause many problems, though. A little bit of cosmetic damage, that sort of thing. The bigger issue is the very closely related species called the forest tent caterpillar. Eastern tent caterpillar that makes a tent, forest tent caterpillar, same genus of caterpillars, very close relatives, but the forest tent caterpillar, despite its name, doesn't make a silken tent. However, they can be pretty destructive if you have them in abundance. And in general, they will have these cyclical patterns. And you go back to about 1999, 2000, somewhere around there, there was a big outbreak in the North Woods. And so if anyone was up here around that time, you probably remember them coating the roads, defoliating trees in spring. And in a nutshell, we're a little surprised we haven't seen them in huge numbers since that time. In my mind, they're a little bit overdue. Wouldn't surprise me if any year now we saw a big outbreak of them again. So again, we've kind of been watching them for a while. I will say in the last couple of years, I have seen some increased activity and notable damage of wooded acreage just to the south of us a little bit, in like Lincoln County, for example. So I don't know if that's kind of the increase phase, and we might see more of them in a couple of years. That's a possibility. But it's something that is out there. It's a native species, really found statewide. And they'll feed on a wide range of trees. So the eastern tent caterpillar, again, that makes the tents, black cherry, apple, crabapple, some fruit trees, things like that. But the forest tent caterpillar, they love things like aspens, which no shortage of aspens up in this part of the state, but really a wide range of other hardwood trees as well. So if and really when that one has a big year or a couple of years again, wouldn't surprise me if that's in the next decade or so. But it's going to be hard to miss that because there's going to be a lot of defoliation, caterpillars coating the roads again, and so on. But in a nutshell, it's out there statewide, but their numbers have been relatively low for quite a while.
Hi, I was just wondering what kind of, in your studies, what kind of international cooperation you're getting, and if you're seeing, similar type trends in other countries, or if there are other ecosystems where you can have a more exclusive type study on what's happening.
Yeah, great. Are you referring to like insect declines? Or?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, in general, yeah.
Yeah, great question. So in terms of like insect decline, so I don't necessarily work and specifically do research in that field, but I do keep very much up to speed on it. And so I do know there are folks around the world working on insect declines. I mentioned there was one of the biggest papers that came out of Germany in the last decade or so. There's a lot of research being done here in North America. There's been a lot in some of the tropical areas that could be South America or Caribbean islands as well. There's actually quite a bit coming out of the UK that's been interesting. One really interesting paper there looked at, and again, this is part of that death of 1,000 paper cuts. It's not one single thing, it's all these interacting factors. But one key interacting factor they've looked at is what they call ALAN. Hopefully there's no one named Alan in here. ALAN is an acronym for artificial light at night. So you go outside, there's lights on at night. We know lights draw insects to it. Well, how many lights do we have now compared to 100 years ago, 200 years ago? None, essentially, 200 years ago or whatnot. And so that is playing a role in terms of disrupting insects. That can do a couple things. Either directly, if it's confusing the insects and they're just flying in circles, they're not going about their normal business of mating and making more caterpillars or that sort of thing. But also, if you have these insects that are just flying around lights, that's easy picking for things like bats. And so that can impact them as well. And so there's been a study that came out of the UK that basically looked at the ALAN, again, the artificial lighting at night, and that was shown to have a negative impact on moth populations in the area. And so I think we'll hear more and more about that. I know in the last 10 to 20 years, I've heard a lot more about kind of the dark sky movement, avoiding light pollution and things like that. And so I think there can be a lot of win-wins if we're able to modify some of our lighting to make it better for insects, but also other creatures and wildlife as well, while still providing the same benefits to humans of visibility and safety and things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of research going on from a kind of a coalition of international scientists, and I think we're going to be hearing even more in the coming decade or two.
I get to ask the last question. What was the name of the fly that interacts with the Asian beetle?
Yeah, it's called the winsome fly.
The winsome.
Winsome.
Is that only interact with Asian beetles? Is it native to this area, or is it invasive as well? What's a little bit of sort of the life history and how that interacts with the rest of?
Yeah, if
our
I
area?
remember correctly, I believe that one was introduced, but it's specific to Japanese beetle. So in any case, I do know, that specificity. So it's not something that is going to be attacking monarch butterflies or anything like that. But it's something that seems to be catching on in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the upper Midwest. And I really wonder if in the next 20, 30 years, if that might help bring their populations down.
Okay, please, let's all thank PJ Leash. Thanks so much. That was great. And thanks again to our sponsors. Thanks to Rocky Reef. And to our sponsors, WXPR, UW Trout Lake Station, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Minocqua Public Library, and Wisconsin Alumni Association. Hopefully I got everybody in the Brittingham Fund. Thanks so much. And remember, our next Science on Tap will be November 7th. Remember, we're always on the first Thursday of the month. And we'll have Bryn Lodig discussing her book, No Child Left Inside. And if you want to be on our mailing list, we have a clipboard over there by the door. Please sign up and you'll get alerts every month. And thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you in another month.